Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll look at the story of the development, design, and performance of the tank, which made its global debut on the battlefield in the First World War, and consider whether this innovative new weapon was the key to winning the conflict. Hello again, Dan. Another day, another podcast. Always a pleasure to be recording with you today. And our subject for today, of course, is armoured fighting vehicles of the First World War, and specifically the tank. And it's a subject that I'm certainly passionate about, and it's also one that I know you've got a great interest in.
Yeah, hi Spence. What a fascinating subject, and one which no doubt we could talk for a very long time about. There are so many amazing things to cover when it comes to understanding the story of the tank. I mean, really right from its formative years, its development in the early part of the war, kind of how it came about. I think the reason it came about is really fascinating as well. Maybe that's the best place to start, because in order to understand why there's a tank on the battlefield in the First World War, you've got to understand why there's a need for them in the first place.
That's a very, very good point. And one thing to just get across about this is the idea of some sort of vehicle, whether propelled by horses, whether propelled by individual men, or whether propelled by machinery that could carry you into battle, is an idea almost as old as warfare itself. We can trace it back to chariots in the Middle East, in antiquity. We can bring it forward right until the idea of trains, and almost as soon as trains were invented, people began thinking about how to strap guns and weapons onto them. But the idea of an independent armoured fighting vehicle that could move troops forward and could provide cover for them, and also be carrying potentially weapons that could engage the enemy, was a pretty recent one before the First World War. And one of the little fascinating details about the development of the tank is, in some ways, the tank was an item taken from science fiction, because in 1903, famous British sci-fi author H.G. Wells, probably most famous for War of the Worlds or perhaps The Time Machine, wrote a short story in the Strand magazine. Strand magazine, a very popular story magazine of the day, called The Land Ironclads, in which a series of about 100-foot-long armoured fighting vehicles packed with men, heavily armed men it might be added, assault a series of trenches. And H.G. Wells was actually drawing his inspiration from Britain's experience fighting against trenches in the Boer War between 1899 to 1902. But his prediction of these heavily armoured vehicles moving forward, immune to bullets, immune to artillery shells, was in many ways quite prescient. And indeed, when the first need for tanks emerged in the First World War, comparisons were made to this story. And the idea about using tanks in combat was not entirely new to the British Army in 1914. Indeed, before 1914, there had been experiments with using armoured plate on wheels. Now, this was man-portable. You'd essentially have a large shield that you'd roll over the ground. You'd have a team of about 4 men trying to push it. There'd be loopholes in it you could fire through. That had been experimented with quite a lot, actually, in the later part of the early 1900s. But, of course, it had been found impractical. It was very heavy. It was difficult to maneuver, even with 4 men. It didn't provide that much use for cover. But what was clear by 1914, when the war began, was that there needed to be some way of protecting men as they crossed that open ground between the trenches, because really the problem that tanks were designed to solve was machine guns, and they were absolutely deadly to the British Army in 1914 and 15. The German Army well equipped them, of course, assaulting into German trenches. The British were facing hails of bullets, and no amount of flesh and blood could get through these. And so on Boxing Day, on 1914, the so-called Boxing Day Memorandum was produced by a British officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, which, amongst other ideas for improving the way Britain fought the war, came up with an idea for a tracked armoured vehicle, a machine gun destroyer, in fact, he called it, that would be resilient to machine gun bullets and could drive into the German trench and, initially in his first conception, actually crush the machine gun beneath its wheels or beneath its tracks. And from this memorandum, the tank would be born. It was the very first seed that was planted for it. But Important to emphasize what a revolutionary idea this was. We've gone from a science fiction story about tanks in 1903 to effectively the tank hitting the table for the British Army in 1914, just 11 years. And I think it's worth remembering just how much technology is improving in this time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think by the same measure to a certain extent, it's also understandable because the various components that ultimately go to make up a tank are in some way, shape, or form already in existence. Tracked vehicles are something that are used. They're used in agriculture back at home at the time. So the idea of having a tracked vehicle to cross difficult terrain, that's in existence. People understand that works. The idea of having some kind of protective measures, as you've described, of allowing men to cross no man's land without getting killed is another one. And combining these concepts into one single item, in this case what will later become known as the tank, is not overly surprising in that way. I think we should go back to the general idea here. The premise in 1914 in many ways is that the weak link on the Western Front are unfortunately the soft squishy people who are made of flesh and bone, because these are the guys that need protecting. And the problem that you get in trying to cross no man's land, particularly with that famous trifecta we've just been discussing, and we've discussed many times in previous podcast episodes, machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. These three things have really locked down the Western Front as far as infantry going over the top and managing to make gains go. So in order to unlock that trifecta, that something needs to change, something needs to be introduced that can do that. And if you think about it, the tank, with the exception of perhaps artillery, is able to deal with two of those three problems. Now, this, as we go through the development, is going to become more clear that as you bring other components in, you do come up eventually with a method that can do that. But as far as barbed wire is concerned, that's no longer going to be a major issue for tanks. And machine guns are no longer a major issue for tanks. Artillery, as we say, is still going to be a problem. But the concept absolutely makes sense. As far as I can see it, the idea of developing something that's going to get you across no man's land in relative safety and potentially in numbers is a really good one. So there's no surprise, Spence, really, when it comes to it, that these prototypes are developed, and developed actually fairly quickly, really from 1915 onwards.
It's really not. And sometimes, and certainly you can see this in the First World War, you can see this in the modern era, sometimes a great idea will come across the Ministry of Defense, or in this case, the Department for War's desk, and just nobody is there to really take it forward. And it languishes in somebody's desk drawer, somebody's in tray. Nobody really picks it up. Nobody really understands it. Nobody really is there to drive it forward. In this case, Swinton's initial proposal on Boxing Day 1914 is picked up by a very, very powerful ally, and that's Winston Churchill. Of course, a young Winston Churchill. He's at the Admiralty at this stage. He's the First Lord of the Admiralty. And Winston Churchill is always drawn to innovative solutions and daring solutions, and he becomes an immediate champion of the tank. And crucially, too, he is able to assign £70,000 in 1915 of the Navy's money for developing the tank. In fact, the tank is initially called the land ship because it rather resembles a battleship except on land. And it was Churchill's initial support for the tank and, of course, crucially providing money and ensuring people were going to follow it that it really drove this project forward. Otherwise, it would have been quite possible it would have just been another good idea that was never taken forward. And Churchill was an immediate fan. In fact, in early January 1915, he wrote to Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, laying out pretty much exactly what you've said, Dan. And I'd like to quote part of this letter because I think it's quite interesting, giving you the initial, really the design brief for a tank. And Churchill wrote to Asquith saying, "The question to be now solved is not the long attack over a carefully prepared glacis of former times, but the actual act of getting across 100 or 200 yards of open space in wire entanglements. All this was apparent more than 2 months ago, but no steps have been taken and no preparations have been made. Yet it would be quite easy to fit up tractors with armoured shelters in which men and machine guns could be placed, which would be bulletproof. The Caterpillar system would enable trenches to be crossed quite easily, and the weight of machines would destroy all wire entanglement. These engines could advance into the enemy's trenches, smash all obstructions, and sweep the trenches with their machine gun fire. And in typically excitable Churchillian prose, Churchill's captured the design essence of what will ultimately become the tank. And he's picked out a really key aspect of that tank too, and that's the fact it's going to be using caterpillar tracks.
He has, and another word that he uses in there, I think, is also going to highlight one of the major issues that comes about as a result of tank warfare. And he, rather importantly, uses the word weight there, because weight is going to be absolutely essential in terms of the development of the tank. And really, it's the battle that designers have to overcome, because, of course, in order to create protection for troops, you're going to need heavy boilerplate. In this case, it is literally boilerplate at first, not armor, not anything else. It's ship's boilerplate, which has got typically 6, 8, possibly 10, later up to 12 millimeters of protection, enough for small arms fire, but it comes with a lot of weight. Now, remember, we're talking about a period of time as well here where you do not have particularly powerful engines. And the battle that needs to be fought here really on the, if you like, on the schematic table where people are trying to figure out how to create these tanks is how to have something that's light enough to be able to propel forward, but heavy enough to be able to provide protection. Now, in doing that, weight plus protection has a negative impact on speed. And this is really the battle, Spence, in terms of the design schematics, at least, and what a tank is designed to do. It really comes down to a lot of these factors.
It does. In the design of any kind of armored fighting vehicle, you've got that trade-off. Do you want speed and mobility? Do you want firepower? And do you want armor? Getting a perfect blend of all these is really difficult, and it becomes even more difficult in 1950 when you consider that no one has ever made a fighting vehicle like this before. As we've said, it's a science fiction concept. Now, caterpillar tracks do exist. They exist on agricultural machinery, but of course they're designed for pulling and towing objects and for carrying out agricultural work. They're not inherently designed to carry fighting vehicles on top of them. And this is the initial problem that needs to be solved. How are you going to balance engine propulsion with the weight of the fighting machine that's going to be on top of it? And the initial design work that's carried out, there's a number of fathers of the tank, if you will, but in terms of design work, one of the real key figures is William Triton. I'm never quite sure if it's pronounced Triton or Triton. It's double T, but he's actually an agricultural engineer. And it's he who's going to be trying to solve the initial problem. How do you build an actual tank? And his first concept is fairly straightforward. He's going to take caterpillar tracks and he's going to put an armored fighting box on top of them. Not a bad concept in itself. It's really a proof of concepts, and it's begun in the early part of 1950, and it'll eventually produce the first prototype tank, which I'm very happy to say still exists at the Bovington Tank Museum here in the UK. And this very first tank, officially it's known as the #1 Lincoln machine, named after the works in which it's been built, William Foster and Company of Lincoln, an agricultural producer. But it's forever known by its nickname, which is Little Willie.
Indeed, it is indeed. In fact, one of the fascinating stories about Little Willie and its very first trials, if I recall correctly, you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, Spence, I think it's the Earl of Salisbury's place in Hatfield, so Hatfield House, who is he's given over his golf course, believe it or not, to be able to test this tank. So this tank is roaring around, ripping up this chap's golf course. He's got a few quid, so it's not. Don't feel too sorry for him. But what's most important is that this tank, this prototype tank, which does have its issues and its drawbacks, at least I think, and this is something that we see repeatedly with the story of the tank, it shows just enough promise. And this is something we see on the battlefield time and time again, in fact. And when we were talking about the kind of development of these things, and you mentioned, Spence, about a number of them end up as good ideas on tables, you can kind of think when you look at development of tanks in particular, they go through a series of trials. And these trials are literally to figure out whether this thing is workable. And the tank at every level, every stage it gets to, shows just enough promise to move on to the next level. And eventually, of course, it will make its way out to the battlefield. But spare a thought, and I think this is a great time to bring this in, spare a thought for the people that were involved in the trials of the first tank, particularly those guys inside them. Because if there's anything I think that any of us know about tanks in the First World War, they are not a comfortable environment.
They really are not. They are not designed for comfort in any way. They are fighting vehicles first and foremost. And in terms of just some of the problems with actually operating in a tank, well, I'm sure I'll get onto those a little bit later as well, but just with Little Willie bounces. Little Willie, for listeners, it weighs somewhere in the region of about 16 tons, and it's only driven forward by a 105 horsepower engine, so it's not got a huge amount of push behind it. But nevertheless, it's still a very, very bumpy ride. Its top speed is only about 2 miles per hour, but the vibration inside Little Willie is absolutely terrible. It will make your teeth chatter. You'll be shaking. Apparently, crewmen get out of Little Willie and their hands are shaking just from the vibrations that they've actually been experiencing inside. So it's pretty tough inside there. And it has to be said that right up until the very last tanks of the First World War, comfort for the crew is of a very, very low priority. Tanks are very small. As you mentioned, Dan, there's this trade-off between weight and power. And because the engines available to the British that are going to be suitable for a tank in 1915-16, they're only 105 horsepower, they're very small. Anything you can do to try and reduce the weight or make space for something more useful comes at the expense of crew comfort. And so I've never seen this written, but I have to imagine that there must have been some sort of height restriction on being a tank crewman, because if you were tall, you must have been in for an appalling ride. I'm not especially tall, and I've been inside the First World War tanks at the Bovington Tank Museum, and just folding yourself into the seats, particularly the gunner's seats, my goodness, it's enough to give you a spinal injury just sitting down. And when you combine that with the idea this tank would be shaking just from its engine, it would be bumping as it bounced and crashed over broken ground. My God, it's a recipe for a slip disc.
It's a really horrible place to be. Just imagine, this is before anybody's even shooting at you, by the way. You know, this is in trials alone. This is made up of angular bits of metal. Inside this metal box is lots of stuff that you can hit yourself against, crack your head on, basically injure yourself in numerous ways. Now, you need to add to that the fact that you're in a fighting compartment with an engine, an unexhausted engine, right in the middle of it. This is going to be running at super hot temperatures. It's going to basically boil the inside of the tank. There's carbon monoxide getting generated. You've got crewmen, 8 of them in the earliest tanks. They're going to be squashed together. They're going to be dirty. They're going to be fed up. They're going to be probably have a banging headache from the amount of carbon monoxide that's been spewed out from this thing. It's a really, really loud, disorientating, horrible place to be. This is just in trials. Now, of course, when they're going to make their way out to the battlefield, they're also going to become a magnet for anything that can fire a bullet. So just imagine what these conditions would be like. And, you know, I have to say, Spence, you know, one of the things that maybe we overlook sometimes when we talk about the tanks in the First World War is, you know, just what bravery and courage and determination the crewmen, the early crewmen in particular, had to display in order to even get into one of these things.
That's very true. And this is something that I think we're apt to forget in the 21st century, where we live in a much more mechanical age. In the early part of the 20th century, yes, the Industrial Revolution had peaked and so forth, but for a large number of people, a large number of British soldiers, they would have no experience operating anything like a tank. Car ownership was absolutely minimal and was dictated by basically being rich. Some people might have ridden buses and may have ridden on trams and so forth, but actually driving one or knowing how to handle it, there weren't that many people in Britain who had that kind of mechanical experience. And certainly outside the cities, that kind of experience was even more limited. And in fact, when the tanks began recruiting for their crew, when the first calls went out, secrecy was paramount, but they were looking for a real mixture of people because they needed people who knew how to drive vehicles. They knew something about mechanical engineering, so they put out a call for them. They needed people who were experienced with heavy weapons because there were going to be heavy guns fitted on the tanks. They needed machine gunners because there were going to be machine guns fitted on the tanks. And this is something I think we're apt to forget, that these skills were not really in massive supply in Britain prior to the First World War. Yes, there were people who know how to use mechanical material, but most of them were already employed somewhere else. And so bringing together these tank crews was actually quite a challenge. And then you're going to introduce them to a machine that has never been seen before. You're going to say, this is an entirely new vehicle for you, chaps. By the way, it's extremely dangerous. It's very much a raw prototype, as you've laid out, Dan, this huge engine pumping out carbon monoxide, incredible temperatures inside the tank. here's this new machine, you're going to have to work out how to use it. And at this point, it's worth just saying that after Little Willie's trials in the summer of 1915, the British actually moved direction a little bit with how they were building the tank, because Little Willie, which was essentially an armoured box on 2 tracks, had been promising, but the general feeling was this is not going to suit us for the Western Front. There's a risk it's going to fall into enemy trenches. Its manoeuvrability is quite poor. There's various other weaknesses for it. Instead, an idea was put forward to create a rhomboid-shaped tank, and that's what's going to give rise to that very distinctive look of British heavy tanks, essentially lozenge-shaped, designed to have their tracks run all the way around them rather than sitting the box on top of them. And the first prototype of this will actually be called Mother, and the speed with which this prototype is produced is really quite amazing. When you consider Little Willie gets trialled in the summer of 1915, by December 1915 and into January 16, so just 6 months later, Mother, which is effectively the model for all British heavy tanks of the First World War, is now out and available. And it shows, despite its limitations, it shows that it's actually a much more effective machine than Little Willie. There is, though, a problem, and that's the fact that it's about twice the weight of Little Willie. It's about 30 tons when it's fully ready for combat with petrol and ammunition on board, but it's still only driven forward by that same 105 horsepower engine.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be the same old problem throughout the war, really, until 1918, when we start to see smaller tanks, which I think in a way are going to change the way that we look at tank warfare, even to this very day. But this idea of a rhomboid tank, which, of course, when most of us are considering the First World War, I'd imagine the first image that flashes up in our mind is that of the early Mark 1s, or perhaps the more famous Mark 4 later on. Actually, I think gives a little bit of an idea about the general concept behind a tank as a whole. And the reason it's extended and lengthened is, of course, that it needs to cross trenches. And if you're considering that things need to cross trenches, it gives you, I think, a little bit of an idea about, if you like, the optimism that tanks are seen with, because it's clearly designed to cross trenches and to keep going forwards. Now, this is something that it's not necessarily just now solving the problem of getting across no man's land. It's talking about solving the problem of pushing through and perhaps even beyond enemy positions. Now, there are 2 forms of tank, I think, which are always worth considering when we get to this point. They're both based on the same hull, and we have famously the male and the female versions. Now, both of these have different roles when it comes to the battlefield, but they're meant to be mutually supporting at the same time, and I think this is a fascinating thing to cover. And, of course, unsurprisingly, the ones with the big guns sticking out of the side on sponsons, by the way, which is where these guns are going to be firing. For any of you without an image of tanks in your mind, we're talking about weapons on the side of tanks predominantly here. We're going to have 2 6-pounder naval guns on the side of each tank, and they're going to be firing into the enemy trenches, ideally along enemy trenches. Can even fire on the move, although the chance of hitting anything is about 0. And then you have the female tanks, which are going to be exclusively machine gun armed, and they are going to have, a different role. But the idea is these things are mutually supporting. They can work together on the battlefield. And I think that's something that, at the very least, Spence, we're going to talk in a moment, I'm sure, about the first use of tanks at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in September 1916. But the main thing here, even with tanks themselves, the male and the female, they're designed as a collaborative, cooperative affair. And the same thing can be said about the concept of fighting alongside infantry as well, albeit at first that's probably not very well understood.
This is true, and it goes back to this point we've mentioned several times now about the newness of the tank. And as the tank goes from the drawing board to Little Willie to Mother, and Mother will become the Mark 1 tank, the first British fighting tank that's going to go into action. One thing to remember is it's one thing to build this machine. It's another thing to find the crews. And then it's another thing to say, well, how does this machine actually perform in battle? And there's a few what we might call tank evangelists who are out there who say the tank is going to completely redefine the war. It's going to do everything we need. It's a weapon in itself. There's a few people like that, but the majority of people are actually saying, well, the tank actually has to work with everybody else because it's slow. Once you've buttoned up in the tank, and buttoning up, for those of you who aren't familiar, means you've closed all your hatches. So you've sealed the tank for action. Once you're buttoned up, visibility from your tank as the commander is very, very limited. Can't really see much around you. And if your viewing periscopes are smashed by gunfire, you can't see anything. So low visibility, low speed, difficult mechanical reliability. The tank in itself is not going to be a decisive weapon. It's going to have to work with infantry. And in fact, one of the reasons why there is the female tank, which is packed with machine guns rather than having a field gun attached to it instead, is the females are designed to really scourge enemy infantry and keep the enemy infantry's head down. So if the enemy infantry are trying to rush a tank, they're going to be hit by all this machine gun fire from the females. There's also a practical reason. That's that the British don't have enough 6-pounder guns, which are the heavier guns used in the Mark 1 male versions, to equip everybody. So they start using male and females instead. But how are these tanks actually going to work in battle? And the initial commander of the tanks is Ernest Swinton, who was the man who proposed them in Boxing Day back in 1914. And I feel quite sorry for Swinton in 1916 because he has this entirely new branch of fighting machines, crewed by men who are trying to learn how to use these things. And just to reiterate, listeners, each Mark 1 tank has an 8-man crew. So there's a lot of men in these tanks. They're trying to learn how to use it. They're trying to learn how to get the best out of their machines. At the same time, and I feel real sympathy for Swinton and his guys here, as the tanks begin to appear in France in 1916, they become absolutely the thing to see. If you are anybody important in British society and you have a chance to go to France, the star attraction is going to see the tanks. And these poor guys who are trying to learn how to fight their machines, trying to keep them running, keep having to do tricks and stunts for royalty, for senior commanders, for anybody who happens to pass by. And it's a bit like a circus, in fact, as the tanks are preparing for action.
Yeah, it is. I think it's Bermicourt that they're based out of, actually. It's one of their main headquarters. And it's from this area that you can imagine at the same time as 1916 comes about, you get these tanks start moving across to the Western Front. You have to remember there's a little bit of background we need to establish here as well, of course, because the 1st of July 1916, the Battle of the Somme has kicked off. And has kicked off, as we've covered previously on this podcast, in horrific fashion. Terrible casualties have been sustained. Germans are really holding on very hard to their own front lines and their deeper positions around the Somme. And the Brits and the French are having a very tough time making any real progress. And this is where I think perhaps the first controversy related to tanks comes about, because the fact that they're even brought into the battle at all has always been questioned as to whether it was the right move to make. Now, you can imagine if you put yourself in Douglas Haig's shoes for a moment, or Rawlinson more specifically, they're really struggling here. They're losing significant numbers of men, but they do have at least the potential in the tank to change things. And as soon as that opportunity comes up, it's okay, well, what do we do here? Do we, on the one hand, wait and build up our tank force and hit the enemy with an overwhelming attack, which is really going to shock them with huge numbers of tanks? We're going to see that the following year as things happen. Or do we work with what we've got and put in a few dozen tanks and try and make a breakthrough right here and right now and save lives in doing so? Now, I think there's something of an unhappy compromise that's reached in this situation, because as it turns out, on the 15th September, despite the fact the tankers are still not really au fait with not only running each individual tank, but certainly operating together and being a useful force, and even knowing what their job is on the battlefield, they're going to be put into action on the 15th September with mixed results, I think.
I think this is a really interesting point, and I'd love to just dive into it a little bit more, because this decision to commit tanks in September 1916 would be a huge source of controversy through the rest of the First World War into the 20s and 30s. And in fact, it wasn't until the outbreak of the Second World War that really the controversy died down. And it's controversial for several reasons. One, as you've already laid out, these tanks are not ready for battle. The crews are still learning how to use them. There's still mechanical problems with them. And just to emphasize something more, the Mark 1s that are actually in France were originally intended to just be training vehicles, to actually train up crews, learn how to use them. They're not, strictly speaking, meant to go into battle, which is something that I think is often forgotten, although quite clearly the army is going to use them once they're in the field. And there's lots of things that are on the Mark 1s that you don't really see on the later models. So they've got this huge, complicated steering gear behind them, which basically is useless. It later gets removed. They initially have a very complicated camouflage scheme. It's pretty stunning, actually, but the tanks just get covered with mud, so you don't need to paint your tanks in this complex camo. Various problems like that. On top of this as well, there's also the French aspect, because the French are also developing their own tanks, their own armoured branch. The Special Artillery, as it's known, and they're working on a tank which is actually quite a bit cruder than the British, the Schneider CA1 and the Saint-Chamond, and both of these tanks are more like Little Willie than they are the British tanks, because they're essentially armoured boxes placed on Caterpillar tracks, and the French are actually having quite a few problems getting their tanks up and running. But the French become aware the British have tanks. The two armies have not let each other know they're both working on armoured vehicles up until this point. And the French actually asked the British, don't use your tanks until our tanks are ready too, and then let's make a mass tank attack, probably sometime in early 1917. If you use your tanks prematurely, you're going to give away the surprise. The Germans are going to prepare countermeasures, and we're going to lose a great opportunity. But Douglas Haig, in particular, makes the decision the tanks are going to be used, and this will be controversial for the rest of the war. But spare a thought for Douglas Haig's position, because discussed, of course, the Battle of the Somme previously. It's not going well for the British in July. But by August and September 1916, things are actually starting to move in a different direction. And it's certainly in September 1916, the Allies have got the Germans in a vulnerable position. They're really starting to pound the Germans at the Somme. The tide of battle, though still extremely bloody and extremely attritional, has turned. And the Germans are, if not necessarily on their last legs, they're certainly in a vulnerable position. And from Haig's perspective, the eternal compound optimist, he thinks one last shove will knock the Germans over completely, and we won't need to fight in 1917. Therefore, I want to use these new tanks. He makes the call. He's the army commander. He ultimately has that call, and he decides to put the very, very young, nascent British tank force into action on the 15th of September.
He does, and it's going to be the Battle of Flers-Courcelette where these tanks are first going to see action. And we're not talking huge numbers here. Spence, you'll correct me, it's somewhere in the 30s or 40s total number. It's not big numbers at all.
It's not. It's the actual number of tanks that go into action is, bizarrely, it's still a source of historical controversy, because the exact number has not really been established. They're probably somewhere in the between. I've seen numbers quoted from 32 down to 21 actually going into action. So somewhere in the region of between 20 and 30 British tanks actually managed to go into action. I think about 21 make it off the start line and head into battle. And of course, this is the first battle these tanks have ever fought. It's one thing to actually train and drive around the training parks, test your guns, test your engines, and so on. It's another thing to go actually into action where the enemy is going to be shooting at you. And nobody really knows how to actually do this. Nobody really knows how they're going to cooperate and work with the artillery or the infantry. The artillery decides to leave what are called artillery lanes open for the tanks. They're worried about actually hitting their own artillery with shell fire. That proves to be a huge mistake, because it just means that the areas they're approaching, the Germans aren't being fired on at all. They're not suppressed. And there's other things that are discovered which are completely unanticipated. You could only experience them in battle. And one of the most unpleasant of these is a phenomenon known to armored vehicles as flaking. And flaking occurs when the exterior of a tank is hit by a bullet or a piece of shrapnel, something that's going very, very fast. It hits it and it creates a very small bulge in the armored plate. Now, it doesn't penetrate the armored plate, but what happens is in the interior of the tank, that bulge flies out and tiny bits of metal are knocked loose by the bulge. And those tiny bits of metal fly all around the tank, and they are absolutely razor sharp. They hit you in the eyes, they'll destroy your eyes, you'll be blinded. If they hit you in the face, they will draw blood. And some quite grisly accounts from the early tankers at Flers-Courcelette are of the crew. Basically, they've all got blood pouring out of their face and hands because they're being hit by lots and lots of German bullets. The Germans are just firing at these tanks. They don't really know what they are. They're firing machine guns at them, rifles at them. Yes, those bullets are bouncing off, but you're getting all this flaking inside the actual hull of the tank. So it's pretty grisly. And on top of that, you've got immense heat. The interior temperature of a tank rises to about 50 degrees Celsius after it's been running for a long time, and it's packed with carbon monoxide. In fact, there's been recent academic research to say that basically every single British tank crew is suffering from severe carbon monoxide poisoning after 24 hours of operating their vehicle. And on top of that, you've actually got to fight from your own positions as well. You've got to fire your guns, you've got to steer the tank, you've got to drive it forward, you've got to repair the engine. This is pretty grueling combat.
It is. It's when you're describing it just there, I was thinking about just how difficult a situation these guys found themselves in. Even without anybody firing at you, it's a really tall order. And remember, these are completely non-suspended. There's no suspension attached to these, and we're not going over flat, easy terrain. They're now also understandably becoming a huge bullet magnet. Anybody with a rifle or a machine gun is now firing at these tanks. And of course, mechanical unreliability, you mentioned it yourself. 30 odd tanks supposedly due to go over the top, perhaps 20 or so actually make it to their start line. This is something that will be looked at in future, actually. The thing that I find most fascinating about this is that even though the tanks themselves perhaps don't have a huge impact in terms of what they actually do on the battlefield, they have a huge impact simply by the fact that they are there. And this is something that I think is true of tanks and other weapons as well throughout the Great War. What they do is they create opportunities. And they create opportunities in other positions. Because if you'd imagine a tank of this kind, or a number of tanks crossing no man's land, become the focus of the enemy's attention. As a result, that attention is at least alleviated slightly from attacking infantry, amongst others. And so it does create opportunities in other parts of the line. I'm thinking of the attack that goes in on that very first day. I believe it's Crème de Mont, one of the two tanks. Two tanks, bear in mind, who actually make it to their objective and come back. It's somewhere, I believe, around the sugar factory, around Delville Wood. It's going to make its way up towards the front line, through into the German positions. It's going to draw huge amounts of German fire, and it's going to make it back at the end of the day. But at the same time, what it also does, it frees up the opportunity of the infantry to move forward alongside it. And this is something that's going to be really important, because although tanks, in their own way, don't have the most spectacular of starts, they show, I think, just enough promise to be kept on the battlefield and actually to be reinforced and expanded, because there are going to be plenty of future opportunities coming up. But at the same time, Spence, there are a number of weaknesses identified at this point here. I think mechanical unreliability, everybody really is aware of that. These things are incredibly unreliable. Crew unreliability, but through no fault of their own. It's simply an exhausting and very difficult situation to find yourselves in. Later on, crews are going to have to go right up to the front line and keep all their doors open till the very last moment just to try and survive in these things before they go into action. They, of course, are very vulnerable to the terrain. So we've got shell holes, we've got trenches that can be fallen into, any number of things. And of course, before long, there's going to be enemy firing stuff that actually can do them damage, and it's going to start taking its toll fairly quickly.
It is. And in fact, even at that opening battle on the 15th of September, there's problems noted with the tanks. Mentioned ditching, getting stuck is pretty common. Even though these are all-terrain vehicles, they're pretty crude. They don't have great horsepower. It's difficult for them to pull themselves out of trenches that they get stuck in, or more commonly shell holes. We've already mentioned flaking as they're hit by bullets. And of course, an artillery shell that hits you, a high explosive artillery shell, is more than enough to knock out a tank. There are escape hatches on the tank. They're at the back of the side sponsons. But bear in mind that you've got 8 guys trying to scramble out of an extremely small door. It's basically like a serving hatch. And so if you're hit and your engine catches fire, it's a petrol-driven engine, you have a handful of seconds to escape. So it's pretty grisly in there. But you did mention that the reputation of the tank is in many ways established on the 15th of September. And it is, because although they don't win the battle, they don't turn the tide, they do enough to show promise, and gives rise actually to one of my favorite ever signals sent from an observer aircraft back to headquarters. And this is during the attack on the 15th of September. a British observer aircraft that's trying to monitor where the army is, actually sends a famous signal back saying a tank is walking up the high street of Flers with the British army cheering behind it. And this becomes quite iconic. It gets repeated continuously, in fact, by the British in propaganda. And it does give you some idea about the mood of cautious optimism that I think that surrounds tanks in the aftermath of 1916. And there's going to be more tanks, more British tanks are going to be coming with some improvements. The Mark II starts to appear, and Mark II is again really meant to be a training tank. It ends up getting put into battle. But crucially, the Mark IV, which is going to be the workhorse tank of the British Army, with over 1,200 built by the end of the war, is going to start to arrive on the scene in 1917. But you mentioned that the Germans start to react too, because the Germans are initially a bit shocked by the appearance of the tank. They've got some intelligence saying they're going to be attacked by mechanical vehicles, but it's only when the tanks actually appear in battle they have an idea what this looks like. And initially, the German High Command is quite favourably impressed by what it's seen of these tanks, and it's quite disturbed by them. There's some instances of what we now know as tank shock. Tank shock is a sort of panic that's induced by the close presence of tanks on infantry. There's some sort of intrinsic human fear that's tied to the idea of being run over by a tank. This quite natural fear, I imagine, although your chance of being run over by a tank in the First World War, pretty slim unless you were really unlucky. But there's this natural fear of being run over and crushed by this machine. And so it produces this effect known as tank shock, where people panic at the sight of tanks. And this is observed in the First World War, in the Second World War, and in all wars since. Solution to it is training. And the Germans realize this and say, well, we've got to convince our men that tanks are not invincible. And so the Germans quite quickly start to circulate information saying this is how you deal with a tank. And initially, the two solutions are quite crude. Either make bundles of grenades, just put a load of grenades in a satchel and try and get it onto the roof of a tank where the blast will penetrate the roof of the tank. Or use specialist sniper ammunition. There's a special kind of armor-piercing bullet called a K bullet that the Germans use, that a sniper can actually fire into the tank, and it will penetrate the armor. And of course, if you're in the tank and a bullet suddenly comes winging through, that's pretty disturbing. Your armor's being penetrated. So there's these responses, but crucially, and this is in some ways going to be to the detriment of the Germans, German countermeasures are relatively slow coming forward. The Germans don't call for a dedicated anti-tank gun until 1918, and it doesn't actually get produced until the very end of the war. The TAC-1, the tank anti-cannon, it never sees action. Instead, the Germans are going to rely on a series of improvised responses to tanks. One is the introduction of anti-tank rifles, and these are they're based on elephant guns. Elephant guns are a type of hunting rifle popular in the 18 and 1900s. Huge guns with about a .5 caliber, absolutely enormous rifles designed to shoot elephants and very big game. And the Germans introduced these with the idea they're going to be used to penetrate tanks. They can do that. They are powerful enough to do that, but they're incredibly hazardous to the user. When you fire one of these anti-tank rifles, if you fire it unless it's in a fixed position, in a bunker or so forth, you're going to break your shoulder. Your shoulder is going to be hurled back several inches, several centimeters. Your collarbone's going to crack. Your shoulder's going to separate. So you basically get one shot with this. The Germans very quickly realize you can't put your shoulder against it unless it's in a fixed position. And so the accuracy of these guns is incredibly poor. Basically, you've got guys sort of trying to prop them up and fire them. They go very high. And if there's one photograph, I think, that is everywhere in the British Army in late 17 and into 1918, it's pictures of Tommies posing with captured anti-tank rifles because they're big, cumbersome, not very useful. Number of tanks knocked out by anti-tank rifles, probably pretty negligible. They might give the infantry some confidence, German infantry confidence. They're not very useful. The big killers of tanks, the Germans find, is not anti-tank rifles, it's artillery. Artillery bombardments that hit tanks or fall in the region of tanks can knock them out. You don't even need a direct hit. A big piece of shrapnel goes flying through the side of the tank and into the engine or kills some of the crew. That's a tank knocked out. And also the Germans find if you put a field gun, standard German field gun, 77mm field gun, you put a field gun in a direct fire position, a direct hit from a German field gun will easily knock out a tank. And because British tanks are pretty slow, they're not very maneuverable, And German field guns, by contrast, are relatively low-lying. They're difficult to see. German artillery in anti-tank positions proves pretty effective. And the final measure that they use is one that we're actually seeing in the current war in Ukraine, and that's minefields. Laying minefields, and these are pretty crude minefields. They're basically shells that have been buried so that they're relatively low under the surface, and if a tank drives over them, the weight of the tank will bear down on the detonators in these shells, and it will detonate and blow the tank to pieces. So you can bury quite a few of these shells. The difficulty with burying minefields in the First World War is artillery bombardments set them off and blow them to pieces. And also it's quite time-consuming to do as well. But minefields and artillery and direct fire positions are going to be their primary German countermeasures. And both of them are actually pretty difficult for the British to overcome.
Yeah, and understandably as well. I think a lot of this comes down, as you've rightly said, to speed, because speed is the key in much of warfare, and the lack of it is very often a pretty major hindrance. And one of the things that we find with tanks, particularly those early Mark 1s and 2s, and even the Mark 4s as well, is really they're not very fast. You know, at best, we're talking 4 miles an hour, at best, over perfect terrain. You know, these kind of things, they're not designed to be quick. We should bear that in mind. They're designed to go at infantry walking pace. They're designed to support infantry, to knock out machine gun positions and to subdue the enemy so that the infantry can come forward. At the same time, though, when you're up against a very quick firing, perhaps 77mm German gun that can fire off a half dozen rounds in a minute and can target a tank that's doing 2, 3, 4 miles an hour, you're going to get a hell of a lot of shots at it before it's going to be anywhere near you, particularly if it's trying to fire back at you on the move, because a 6-pounder gun, whilst you're in an unstabilized, unsuspended tank that's rattling around all over the place and you're trying to hit a gun at 300, 400, 500 yards away, don't even waste your time. No point even trying. So you've either got to stop, in which case you become an even bigger target in order to fire, or you've got to push forward and keep moving and hope that you're going to do the job. And that, I think, Spence, is where numbers come into the story. Because at Flers-Courcelette, yes, there were opportunities, and there were opportunities gained by having tanks on the battlefield, but they're not there in big numbers, which means they can be targeted and taken out. And the Brits realised this very quickly. And in fact, the whole argument that we had at the start about whether Haig and the BF should be using tanks with whatever they've got available at the time, whether they're fit for purpose or not, or wait until they've got such an overwhelming number of them that it doesn't matter if half of them get knocked out, you're still going to gain the ground. That's where we come to, and I think perhaps the dawn of the tanks, as far as it comes as a dedicated tank force, and as a real potential breakthrough weapon. And of course, that's going to be the Battle of Cambrai.
It is. And just before we get on to Cambrai, just to emphasize your point about the danger of slow-moving tanks against prepared German defenses who are now have some awareness of what a tank can and cannot do. A great example of this, and in some ways fulfilling the prophecy that the French had warned of in 1916 when they asked the British not to use the tanks too early, save them until the French could deploy their tanks at the same time. Well, that didn't happen, and so the French tanks, when they come into action in April 1917 during the Nivelle offensive on the River Aisne, the French tanks, as I mentioned previously, the Schneider and the Saint-Chamond, cruder tanks than the British in many respects. They're basically boxes on caterpillar tracks. They're relatively heavily armed, but their firing arcs on their guns are extremely low. The Schneider has a heavy gun in just one sponson. It's only got about a 20-degree arc of fire. And the Saint-Chamond has got an enormous gun. It's actually got a 75mm gun right in the front, the biggest tank gun of the war. But it's only got a 5-degree firing arc. So you basically, unless you conveniently stop right in front of the Saint-Chamond, you're unlikely to actually be hit by its incoming fire. As an example, though, about the consequences of perhaps the premature deployment of tanks, we can look at what happens to the French armoured branch in 1917, because the French go into action with their tanks on the River Aisne. They expect quite a lot from them because they're actually attacking with relative mass. They put 132 tanks into the attack in April 1917. This is the largest tank attack on the Western Front up until this point. But the casualties they suffer are really heavy. 76 out of that 132 get knocked out in various ways. And of those 76 casualties, 57 of them are knocked out by German artillery pieces. Now, some of that's artillery barrages hitting them. Others is those German artillery pieces in anti-tank positions just knocking them out, firing directly on them. And it's a really awful battle for the French tank corps. And it shows in many ways that the consequences, because we tend to think very much in British terms, well, we use the tank, we'd learn something from it, it would become useful in 17. Well, those poor French tank crews in April 17 probably weren't thinking that as their tanks were on fire and being knocked out. And that was the consequence, perhaps, of that early deployment. But the battle in April 1917 wasn't completely in vain. The French learned from that bitter experience, and the French became dedicated to developing tank attacks on, if possible, a larger scale using more and more machines, as too did the British. And you mentioned Cambrai. In some ways, the tank arm was a little bit lucky in 1917 that it wasn't called upon by the British to carry out a major assault for much of the war. Tanks played a role at battles throughout 1917, sometimes a controversial role, such as their pretty disastrous performance at Bullecourt in 1917 down with the Australians. But generally, the nature of the battles that were being fought meant the British didn't use that many tanks. Third Ypres in particular was so muddy and so awful that opportunities for tanks were very limited. Although it should be noted that when tanks did get into action at Third Ypres, they often actually did quite well. But it wasn't until Cambrai in the autumn and winter of 1917 that the British finally were in a position to actually launch an all-out tank attack. And this is something that the Royal Tank Corps had been dreaming of really throughout 1917. There'd been a really ambitious proposal. It probably wouldn't have worked, but it's worth mentioning, to try and storm the ridges around Ypres using a mass tank attack. The weather had prevented that, of course, and other plans had taken hold. But the idea of an all-out tank attack that would achieve surprise and break through the Germans had never completely gone away. And by the time of the autumn and winter 1917, with the Battle of Passchendaele had become a real mess, people were looking for a new opportunity to just try and change the pattern of war. Russia was being knocked out the war. The French weren't doing a lot, of course. Cambrai, an attack in a relatively quiet part of the Western Front that was going to take the Germans by surprise and hit them with a pretty staggering number of tanks. The British had 476 tanks in total, of which about 378 were going to action. It's, in many ways, a revolution in warfare, because think about how in the space of just over a year from September 1916, where we've got somewhere between 20 and 30 tanks lumber into action. Well, by November 1917, the British now have nearly 500 tanks at their disposal. And these are overwhelmingly more modern models. The Mark IV is a noticeable improvement on the Mark I. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a more powerful weapon. And crucially, it's not just the number of tanks. As you've made a great point earlier, Dan, it's about how the tanks are going to work with all their supporting arms. Because now, after a year of considering this, training in this, some experience in this, the British got a much clearer idea about how tanks function alongside infantry, alongside the Air Force, and crucially alongside the artillery. And one of the keys at Cambrai is the Royal Artillery is going to carry out a surprise bombardment. It's silently registered its guns using basically very advanced trigonometry and mathematics, which means it doesn't have to fire ranging shots. The first thing the Germans know about the attack is when the bombardment hits them. And that's crucial. It's going to surprise the Germans, and it's going to avoid tearing up all the ground in front of the tanks. So the tanks are going to have not a clear run at the German trenches, but a much more solid run at them. And in fact, the opening of the Battle of Cambrai, well, for a time, it looks like everything's going right.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating case study to look at, in fact, Cambrai. And it comes back to that idea, I think, of opportunity, because that's really what we see, I think, when we look at Cambrai in particular. The numbers, I think, are something that bring a new dynamic to the battlefield, amongst others. One, it's a target-rich environment for the enemy, to the extent that there are so many targets, you can't possibly knock them all out, and they are going to make advances despite them being slow. But it also means that those guys attacking now have opportunities to work, and they've also now had the experience in order to start using things like small-level tactics with small groups of tanks piercing areas of the frontline trench. Bear in mind, in order to take an enemy trench position in the First World War, you don't necessarily need to capture the whole length of a section of line. If you can pierce it in a couple of places and drive through it, you're already isolating your enemy and forcing them either to surrender, to fight to the death, or fall back. And so what we find now is you start to see tank tactics where groups of tanks in fours and sometimes larger numbers are going to aim at the same spot of an enemy trench. And what they're going to aim to do is split open the barbed wire, and they can do that in a couple of ways. One is by crushing the stuff. A second is by dragging a hook and then turning left and right. If you imagine two tanks going towards an enemy section of barbed wire, grabbing hold of a load of barbed wire, turning left and right, and opening a big stretch that allows infantry to follow through or more tanks to follow through, it's now going to give you the opportunity to pierce the enemy position. And as well, one of those images that we might have when we consider tank warfare are fascines, literally bundles of wood sitting on top of a tank. These can be dropped in by a tank that can then use it to cross over a trench and push on to the next line. The other thing that we need to bear in mind here as well, that tanks provide another opportunity in the fact that they're a large, fairly well protected vessel that's moving across no man's land. They provide protection not only for people inside the tank, but people behind it as well. Now, this is one of the controversial points about the Battle of Cambrai, and we could talk about perhaps the 51st Division and how maybe they don't do a good job. But there's a real school of thought at this time is, okay, one, do we want to use the cover that these tanks are providing to get our men across no man's land? And if so, how close do we want to stay to those tanks? Or secondly, are these tanks actually just drawing fire, which gives us opportunities to stay away from them? Our 51st Division, under a general by the name of Harper, I think perhaps get this wrong at the start of Cambrai and perhaps miss an opportunity to really exploit success. But it's controversial at the time.
Yes, it is, because the natural thing for infantrymen to do when there's bullets flying at them is to get behind this big armored box or this series of big armored boxes. They'll provide covering fire. It's a natural reaction. In fact, it's observed by the British in battle that infantry, particularly if the infantry has become separated from its wider unit, will try and cluster behind the tank. But that's very risky because there's a lot of fire coming at these tanks, not just small arms fire, but also artillery fire, either trying to burst over the tank or actually direct fire into the tank. And so you only need one overshot, an artillery overshot against a tank to plow into your platoon behind it, and your platoon is going to suffer horrendous casualties for this. And there's still a sense, I think, at Cambrai of not everybody in the infantry fully trusts the tanks. They're still a little bit unknown. And although the infantry has been training with tanks, now understands what tanks do and understand, how they function, it's one thing to understand it, it's another thing to actually do it in battle, because battle is a completely different environment. There's also an aspect too for the tanks themselves. Yes, you've got hundreds of tanks and they're going to go into action. They're going to fight very hard. One of my favorite stories, the actual overall commander of the tanks, Hugh Ells, he actually goes into action in his own tank, H1 Hilda. He's told you can't go into action. That's it. You've got to stay behind. You're the overall commander of the tanks. He says, absolutely no way. This is our first really big battle. I am going into battle in my own tank, which I attribute, I think, to the toughness of these men in tanks. But what happens is, as well as tanks being knocked out, is the revelation of the mechanical weakness of these tanks. The Mark IV is more advanced than the Mark I, but it's still using that 105 horsepower engine. And crucially too, the conditions inside the tank are pretty much just as awful as they were for the Mark I. Incredibly hot, carbon monoxide poisoning. The armor is less prone to flaking, but it still suffers from flaking. And the solution to that is tank crews actually go into battle wearing leather helmets, or in some cases metal helmets, with literally chainmail face masks to protect them from these small pieces that are flying around, and heavily armored goggles. Well, that's adding more heat to you. It's making it even harder for you to operate. And the crew, a combination of enemy action, the Germans do knock out a number of tanks at Cambrai, and above all else, the sheer exhaustion of the crews. When you've been in action for, say, 12 hours and you've been operating your tank for 12 hours, you are totally exhausted, because although it's not recognized at the time, and this is crucial, that the army at the time doesn't fully understand what's happening to its crews. It knows there's some kind of problem with ventilation, but the science of carbon monoxide poisoning is in its absolute infancy in 1917. They know something's wrong with the crews. They actually think it's the heat. That the tanks are so hot, and so they order the crews, get out of your tank whenever you can and rest, as you've mentioned, Dan. But in fact, it's carbon monoxide, and carbon monoxide lingers in your bloodstream for quite a long time. And these crews are getting carbon monoxide poisoned operating their tanks. And once you reach a certain level, you can't function, you can't stand, you're constantly being sick, you are completely combat ineffective, and within a very short space of time, the British basically run out of tanks through a combination of artillery fire and enemy action, and just the crews are absolutely done for. They're all poisoned.
Yeah, it's such a brutal battle from that point of view, and there are lessons learned. Very, very costly lessons, of course. But for those guys that manage to stay in action, as unlikely as it might seem, they do manage to make some real serious success. And there are some incredible gains made actually at the Battle of Cambrai, particularly in the opening days. Problem that you get though is as these numbers start to dwindle, you start to then come up against enemy positions, and those numbers are not there. And those guys are going to start getting targeted. And there's one particular tank that sticks in my mind, Spence, as you were talking there. And it's D Battalion's D51, known as Deborah. Deborah's a bit of a legend on the Western Front. For anybody that's had a chance to go out there, highly, highly recommend it. So Deborah is actually advancing through the village of Flers-Courcelette in the latter stages of the opening day of the Battle of Cambrai. She's one of those that is still in action, despite the incredible difficulties of the crew. She's making her way up through Flers-Courcelette High Street, along with another tank. In fact, the other tank is a random bit of trivia for you. The commander is John Lennon's school teacher, a Liverpool native, so he goes on to teach John Lennon in his later years. But as D51 is making her way up, she, of course, is now going to be, once again, a target for huge amounts of artillery fire. And in fact, it's a series of guns that have been put fairly early here into a dedicated anti-tank role, and they've been kept on the reverse slope of the hill. They're wheeled into position as D51, Deborah, she trundles her way up the road, and she gets hit very hard by a German shell, which basically rips the front off this Mark IV tank. If ever you want to know, as you well described earlier, Spencer, what damage a high explosive shell can do to 8 millimeters worth of boilerplate with 8 guys in it, it's absolutely horrendous. 5 of these guys killed outright. The reason the tank today is so well known, by the way, is that after the war, she's moved to the side of the road where she's knocked out. She's actually buried under the road and forgotten about. And she's discovered in 1998. And today has her very own museum not far from where she was knocked out. In fact, her crew are buried in the British Cemetery just a few meters away. And I highly recommend, if you want to have a Google D51 Deborah, because it's absolutely remarkable to see this tank that was knocked out back then in 1917. But I think what it does serve to highlight, particularly with the crew being so nearby, Spence, is that whilst the losses to the tank corps are huge, for those guys that do survive, and they may survive as gearsmen or as even gunners on a tank, they'll eventually gain experience. And later on in the war, by the time we get to 1980, we start looking at places like Amiens, these guys may even be commanding their own tanks. They're gaining experience the whole time, and the tank force as a whole is improving.
Yes, it is. And just one point to really emphasize that. I mentioned the terrible casualties the French Special Artillery, their tank branch, suffered in April 1917, with a very high proportion of tanks destroyed. At Cambrai, although the tank corps burns itself out, the actual number of tanks knocked out is only fractionally higher, I should say, than the number of French tanks lost to enemy action in April 1917. When you consider the British have almost 4 times as many tanks as the French, that's a pretty good casualty rate, really. Most of the tanks are knocked out because of mechanical failure or crew exhaustion or the tank becoming stuck. A relatively small proportion are actually destroyed by enemy action. And what this means is that although the tanks are being lost because they're broken, they're wrecked, they can't be recovered, one of the actual features of the Western Front in the winter of 1918 in this sector is British tanks just abandoned in no man's land that become the centre of sort of trench action. Crucially, quite a large number of crews and tank officers are able to survive this experience. Yes, it's a harrowing experience. There are plenty of casualties, killed and wounded, but enough survive that lessons can be learned. And crucially as well, by 1918, the tank, I hesitate to say it's coming of age, but the British are starting to get a tank that is, if not necessarily game-changing, it's definitely a huge improvement on what previously existed, and that's the Mark V. And the Mark V, yes, it looks exactly like a Mark IV to the untrained eye, but it's actually a much improved vehicle because it's gone from having a 105 horsepower engine to a really powerful 150 horsepower engine. That doesn't sound like a huge difference, but it makes the tank a much better vehicle to actually drive and steer. It's got a better steering system. It's got a more powerful engine. Crucially, too, it's actually easier to repair. Its spare parts are more easily produced. Its repair, although it's still a complicated affair, is much more easily carried out, whereas the previous tanks were a little bit fussy, need a lot of work. You've got, in some ways, the beginnings of a really modern, mass-produced vehicle. There's only about 400 get built Mark Vs, but they are, to the tank crews, and I think we have to take their word for it, tank crews that move from Mark IVs to Mark Vs all comment about what a revelation this vehicle is. This is a real improvement. And although it doesn't look that much different, it's a little bit more heavily armored in places. It's got a little bit slightly different weapons arrangement. And crucially, it's a bit faster and it's easier to steer. And so you're starting to get good vehicles, or better vehicles by the standards, with experienced crews who now can work really well alongside infantry, artillery, and crucially, Air Force as well. I mentioned in a previous episode about the 100 days that by 1918, the British have got very good at assigning observer aircraft to specifically look for German anti-tank guns. And when they find them, lots of artillery can be dumped onto that German anti-tank gun position and it can be knocked out pretty quickly. And so that starts to become a game changer as well. And in fact, you're starting to see more and more modern and new style tanks appearing in 1918, because 1918 also is the dawn of what we would suppose we could call the light tank as well.
It is, and there are two tanks in particular that spring to mind here, and I think one of the key things to point out here is they're not designed to do the same role as the heavy tanks, and that's probably quite obvious today, but when they first come onto the battlefield, that's not so obvious. They do have a very specific role, and one of the things that we should bear in mind, and you've rightly mentioned here, Spencer, is this idea of combined arms or all arms warfare and how this comes to the fore really by the middle of 1918. The Germans use it to a certain extent, although they're very light on armour, as I'm sure we'll discuss in a moment. But the Allies, when they do realise that actually, if we go back, in fact, a little bit to this trifecta of things that we've described, that really sews up the Western Front in the Great War, and that, of course, is machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. We've already discussed how tanks can overcome two of those three problems. That, of course, being barbed wire and machine guns. The scourge, though, is artillery, to which I think we could add anti-tank guns if there was anything of that sort during the war. Now, as soon as something does come in, which can now take out that third option, i.e. using aircraft and artillery to target artillery that's targeting tanks, all of a sudden tanks get a much freer reign and a better opportunity. So we can get through enemy positions now. But what do we do once we get there? And this is where this new type of tank comes into things. This is being able to exploit at a much higher speed into enemy positions. The Battle of Amiens in August 1918 is a perfect example of that. You could almost lay it out on the battlefield as well here, Spence. I think you can imagine these tanks going forward, protecting the infantry as they do, taking out barbed wire, allowing the infantry to infiltrate into enemy trenches, taking out machine gun positions. At the same time, we've got aircraft prowling around the skies, directing artillery to knock out anti-tank guns. Now, once all of that's happened, we now have the arm of exploitation and the opportunity to do it for the very first time. And there are two arms that we can follow here. One of them is good old flesh and blood again. This time it's going to be horse flesh and blood, and that's going to be the cavalry. But the second one is this idea of a light tank. In this case, we're going to be talking about British whippets. Now, this is a much faster, when we say whippet, it gives you this mental image of an extremely fast tank. It still probably does, I think, about a maximum of about 9 miles an hour, which is quick for the time. And on decent open roads, which actually we do find from August 1918 onwards, they can do some real damage. I'm thinking particularly of Musical Box here, Spencer, who goes in and tears up some German artillery parks, shoots up an infantry base depot and various other things. But it goes to show that we've now got the break-in element quite nicely packaged with the heavy tanks, but now we've got this option of the breakthrough, the whippets, and of course, more famously, the Renault FT-17.
This is very true. And the development of light tanks, the British insist that the Whippet, incidentally, is a medium tank, and it weighs about 14 tons, got a top speed of 9 miles an hour. So as medium's a better example of all this. The Whippet tank, the proposal for that emerges in 1916. In fact, just a few weeks after the initial attack at Flers-Courcelette. It's been observed that heavy tanks can make a breakthrough, but they're too slow to really exploit it. So a second tank, a faster tank, is needed, and this will eventually lead to the Whippet, of course, named after the speedy dog breed. I'm not sure the tank quite lives up to the speed there, but it's a fascinating addition to the armoured branch, and it's actually a very sophisticated piece of equipment in many respects, in terms of its development from the Mark I, which is very distinctively a First World War tank. The Whippet's a really interesting intermediary position with this sort of turret arrangement, although it can't move, the turret won't rotate. It's only got a 3-man crew, so it's much smaller than the 8-man crew of the Mark I. And crucially, it is fast. And 9 miles an hour doesn't sound very fast, but consider this. The Germans are using field guns to try and engage British and indeed French tanks. Now, these field guns are not specifically designed as anti-tank. They are artillery pieces. Artillery pieces, you can maneuver them around, but it's not easy to do so. To actually traverse an artillery gun, remember, it's just fixed, it's on wheels. You're going to need a lot of manpower to do that. If a tank is coming at you at a diagonal angle, basically it's tracking across you at 9 miles an hour or even 8 miles an hour, then actually maneuvering your anti-tank gun to engage it is much harder than you might think. You're going to have to really lug that gun around. And of course, you're being shot at. The British are looking for you from the air. The tank might be shooting at you with machine guns. It's really, really difficult to do. And if the Whippet is a handful in this respect, then the French light tank, which in many ways is the origin of so much tank design to come in the 20s and 30s, the FT-17 designed by Renault. Really strictly, it should be called the Renault FT. The actual origin of the FT-17 designation, not entirely clear, but it's become closely associated with it. It's a little 2-man tank, but it's very advanced because it actually has a rotating turret. The first tank to actually have this. It's not a powered turret. You've got to crank it with a spin wheel, effectively. Not an easy thing to turn. That turret isn't going to turn very fast, but it's very small. It's mechanically surprisingly advanced and reliable. Relatively fast, goes somewhere in the region of about 5 miles an hour. But crucially, it's quite maneuverable, and it's a small, difficult to hit target. And the French approach for using this tank, which has been under development since around about mid-1916, been various difficulties with it, starts to get produced in 17 and then gets produced en masse in 1918, is these little tanks come at you like a swarm of bees. And they don't just rush at your position head on. Instead, they crisscross across no man's land. They're difficult to engage with this big, heavy German field gun. They're small, they're difficult to hit, relatively fast. And there's lots of them, and they're coming at you like a swarm of bees. And as a German anti-tank gunner, you've got a real problem with these tanks. Your 77mm is not designed to engage these relatively speedy, small, difficult to hit targets, and they come rushing forward into action. And the Renault FT will become the definitive tank for the French in 1918. It'll also be used by the Americans as well. The Americans choose to equip their army with a mixture of British heavy tanks and French light tanks, so they get the best of both worlds in many respects. But the appearance of dozens of these French tanks swarming towards you as a German anti-tank gunner, pretty nightmarish, I think.
Yeah, and there's a interesting role about them as well. And I think what you raised there about the Americans using both the British heavies and the French light tanks is a really important point, because as we've established, they do have a different role. Now, the fascinating thing about the Renault is that they've kind of got a cavalry role, but cavalry in 1914, because the cavalry that still is relevant on the battlefield in 1918 has taken on a different role. What we're looking at here with these light tanks, though, is a bulletproof horse in many senses. A bulletproof horse that doesn't get tired. You know, this can have a real major effect. If it can get through, it can exploit positions. It also bring in with it, in effect, a heavy machine gun. Now, this is a really effective, really powerful, and very potent weapon on the battlefield. Spencer, you drew a great picture earlier when you were talking about the idea of wheeling a gun round as you're trying to track a tank, you've got to reset the position, you've got to reset your aim, you've then got to reload the shell, and then you've got to fire a shell. And if you miss, you've got to reposition and line up all again. That's a very slow process. What's even slower is moving one of these guns. If you've got to move a gun, you're maybe going to, at best, you might do a mile an hour with a crew dragging it around a couple of miles an hour if you're absolutely working your socks off. Well, when a Renault FT or a Whippet tank is doing 8 or 9 miles an hour, it's not going to be very long before you're out of range. And so actually, once that crust of anti-tank guns or artillery pieces that can knock out these tanks has been broken through, all of a sudden you're in an incredibly vulnerable position. And there's no surprise that tanks, Whippets and Renaults are able to really chew up the German vitals once they get through that kind of crust of no man's land. Now, it's not plain sailing, of course. These are still targets, and if they are hit, Renault is not going to survive a 77mm shell in the turret by any stretch of the imagination. They're still tough places to be, and they still take a hell of a lot of bravery to get involved, but they are still also providing opportunities. The infantry is not alone on the battlefield anymore as it was in 1915, 1916, or 1917. All of a sudden, you've got these other factions that you can call on. And when we combine them with all of the other things we've already discussed in this series, Spencer, in terms of air power and new platoon tactics and being able to clear barbed wire and all of these kind of methods, it's no great surprise, actually, that these provide another great arm in terms of breaking trench warfare and, I suppose, ultimately ending the war.
They do. And of course, by 1918 too, the war is changing a little bit because the Western Front isn't this huge, massive fixed defences that it was through 15, 16 and 17. Still areas which are like that, such as the Hindenburg Line. But as you mentioned in the 1918 episodes we've done, the Western Front becomes much more like the Second World War, where yes, there's entrenchments, but it's not of the nature of earlier in the war. Yes, there's strong points, but they're based on forests and villages and high ground and so forth. The front has become what historians call semi-mobile. And into this type of battlefield, these light tanks become incredibly useful because, as you said, Dana, it's a really good point. You've effectively got an armoured mobile machine gun coming with you. And that is incredibly useful. It can work onto an enemy's flank. It can keep them pinned down from the front. It can outmaneuver them while your infantry get close to actually capture the position. It's really, really useful and important. And your comment that these are sort of armoured cavalry is not too far from the mark. I'm reminded of George S. Patton, of course, later to achieve fame in the Second World War. He's a tank commander in an FT-17, and he actually says he really likes the FT-17 because it bucks like a horse. It's a bit like riding a horse. It's a bumpy ride, but it's an exciting ride as well. You are charging into action on this machine gun going. There's dozens of your fellow tankers hopefully in action with you. It's an exciting experience. And the Germans increasingly have more and more difficulty dealing with enemy tanks, or allied tanks, I should say. It's certainly by the middle part of 1918, as the 100 Days is about to begin, most German divisions are allocating as much as a quarter of all their artillery strength in anti-tank gun role. So you're sending these guns down close to the front line to use them as anti-tank guns. That's a lot of artillery you're dedicating to engage tanks that then can't be used to fire in support of the rest of your infantry. And the fact that Germans are using so much of their precious artillery stock in this role gives you some idea about how dangerous tanks have become. They might not be decisive in and of themselves, but if you don't do something about them, they're a very serious threat and they're going to overrun your position. But without a dedicated anti-tank gun, the Germans don't have one, all they can rely on is their field pieces to do this. And as we've discussed now, the lighter tanks that begin to appear, well, they're more than a match for the latest in German anti-tank gun technology. And that's going to be a real problem for the Germans throughout the 100 Days. And the Germans never really solve it. They do have a dedicated anti-tank gun. It's about a 25mm anti-tank gun they're working on, never sees action. It may never even be produced. The first prototypes are around in late October 1918, so way too late for them to actually see action. And this actually raises a point where if the Allies really make the most of armoured warfare, it's worth reflecting on, well, what did the Germans do with their armour?
Well, that's a really good point. And I suppose that there's a backstory to this. And one of the major reasons that we don't hear a lot about German tanks, well, the obvious one is they don't make a hell of a lot of them. And the second one is that there's a good reason why they can't make a hell of a lot of them, because we've been strangling many of their supplies for a significant period of time. And so the resources, amongst other things, are not really there. The famous German tank, which is going to take to the battlefield in very, very, very small numbers, is going to be the huge A7V with an outrageous crew. Spence, I'll leave you to do the details in a moment, of something like 20 men. It's a huge box on wheels, which is, if anything, a bit more of a propaganda tool, and will spend some time on the battlefield. In fact, up by Villers-Bretonneux, will take part in the first ever tank-on-tank action. It's something along the lines of 20 of them produced, and perhaps as many as a dozen or 14 are going to actually spend time on the battlefield. Not particularly effective, and not really anything to write home about, other than the fact we have to mention it. I think one of the things that we can mention, though, and mention with some real importance, is the fact that the Germans are not overlooking the fact that tanks do have some promise. And one of the things that tells us that is that they re-employ quite a lot of British tanks into the field on their own side.
They do, and the story of German tanks is really interesting in my opinion, and worth just outlining a little bit here, because the Germans get hit by tanks, of course, in September 1916. Initially, German High Command is alarmed by this. They're not sure how many tanks the British may have, worried they might be hit by tanks repeatedly through late 1916. Doesn't really happen. And once that initial, I wouldn't say panic, initial concern about Allied tanks has receded, the Germans then take a sort of ambivalent attitude towards tanks and say, well, the tanks didn't really do a lot for the Allies. We're not super interested in them. One of the reasons for that is the Germans are mainly concentrating on offensive operations on the Eastern Front, where tanks aren't going to be particularly useful. Not so bothered about them on the Western Front. That said, the Germans are working on armoured vehicles, but fascinatingly, their main interest is creating an all-terrain truck. Because the Germans are always short of trucks, especially on the Western Front, and they're losing trucks all the time. Their trucks shed tyres, they break wheels, all kinds of problems. So their initial call for Caterpillar-tracked vehicles is in the form of an all-terrain transport vehicle. And the A7V, which you've mentioned, in some ways is an outgrowth of various experiments to try and create an all-terrain truck, which they never managed to do. And when you look at it, and listeners do look up an A7V tank, it's a huge box on Caterpillar tracks. Essentially, it's Little Willie plus size. It's absolutely enormous. Its crew, it has a minimum of 18 crew members. The most that ever go into action in one is 25 men. Absolutely outrageous. It's actually, one of the interesting things about it, though, is it's actually quite quick on roads. It has a test speed of almost 10 miles an hour on a road. Pretty good. But across country, it becomes disastrous because it's such a bulky, heavy design. It's always falling over. It's always breaking down. They're really, as you say, Dan, propaganda tools. Now, the British actually greatly overestimate the number of German tanks that are available and become really worried that Germans are going to launch 300, 400 tanks at them. Doesn't happen, of course. And fear about German tanks actually stays relatively high in the British Army until April 1918. You already mentioned the tank-on-tank engagement at Villers-Bretonneux, and I'd love to cover that in detail in our own episode. But in the aftermath of that, the British actually capture an A7V crewman. He's actually a wounded driver from one of the tanks, and they take him away for interrogation. It turns out he's actually a Polish conscript, and he's more than happy to tell the British absolutely everything about the tank, about how it works, about what it does, about how many tanks there are. He basically tells the British everything he knows, and then once he's run out of things he can tell them he knows, he tells them opinions instead. And it's an information coup, and the British realise then, well, we don't have anything to worry about from A7Vs. You did mention, though, that the Germans are also retooling and repurposing British tanks, and these are Butpanzer borrowed tanks, mainly Mark IVs, captured from battlefields, repurposed, rearmed, so they've got German caliber guns, and put into action. But the Germans don't really have a training program. They don't have an armoured corps in the same way the British and the French do. And these Butpanzer tend to be one-shot weapons. Once they've broken down, which inevitably they do, the Germans aren't really interested in repurposing them. They have some effect. Certainly in March 1918, there's some accounts of Butpanzer going into action and causing some difficulties, but ultimately there's just not enough of them, and the Germans don't have enough resources to really maintain them, build them, or train them. They're a bit of a novelty weapon. They're a bit of a propaganda piece. They're not really going to make a difference to the Germans in World War One.
No, it's very interesting, and I always have to wonder myself whether this is something of a missed opportunity, and whether we had seen tanks in large numbers employed in something like the German Spring Offensive in 1918, whether that would have had a marked effect. And you have to wonder if there was a light tank in particular on the German side, that could have really done some serious damage. Of course, it didn't transpire that way, and so we'll be left ever wondering what might have happened in that situation. A quick point on the A7V, though. If my memory serves correctly, the only surviving A7V is, in fact, that one knocked out at Via Bretonneux called Mephisto, which I think is in a museum in Brisbane in Australia. It was, amongst other things, not to disparage our Australian friends at all, souvenired off the battlefield and found its way back to Oz fairly quickly after the war. But I suppose, Spencer, we need to round up the idea of tank warfare in the Great War. We could, of course, go on into the post-war years and even into the start of the Second World War. I mean, was the tank really a war-winning weapon? I mean, it's a golden question, and one that's been posed many times, Spence, regards the tank usage on the Great War. What would you say?
I'm going to use my historian fig leaf as always and say it's complicated. And listeners, I can tell you there is a debate about this that has gone on since the First World War. Was the tank the key to unlocking it? Both participants in the war, people writing after the war, historians living now still debate the importance or non-importance of the tank. What I would say is that the Allied use of the tank was useful wherever it was employed. And certainly by 1918, when you could combine tanks, artillery, aircraft, and infantry, you had a recipe for success. Combined arms warfare would nearly always achieve its objectives. That's not to say there wouldn't be casualties, not to say there wouldn't be hard fighting, but that combination of these fighting arms was absolutely irresistible for most of 1918, especially in the latter half of it. But tanks were still very crude. They were still, as we've outlined, difficult to maintain. They were difficult to fight in. They had vulnerabilities. They weren't very fast, low endurance, and so forth. I think we could say that the war did more for tanks than tanks did for the war, because we've mentioned, I think, previously in an episode that one thing the British are extremely good at doing at the end of wars is saying, well, that was a pretty bloody war. It's very difficult. We've learned a lot of lessons there, but a war like that will never happen again. And everything we've learned from this war, we don't need to remember because it's never going to happen again. Let's forget everything we've learned. And one of the ironies, I think, of tanks in the First World War is the British worked pretty hard to forget a lot of the lessons. Not all of the lessons, but a lot of the lessons about tank usage that they'd learned so painfully between 1916 and 1918. Whereas the Germans, who, as we said, their tank program, not very effective, will go away and will actually really, really develop a lot of ideas about how the tank is to be used. And of course, that most iconic of books about tanks, Achtung Panzer, is partially inspired and indeed focuses quite heavily on the British tank attack at Cambrai. And that, as a sort of dawning moment for armoured warfare, I don't think can be underestimated. But Achtung Panzer, of course, written by Heinz Guderian, who would go on to be a famous commander of the Second World War, armoured commander. So you can see, although within the context of the First World War, armoured warfare is just one part of the weapons system the Allies used to win, its long-term legacy, its long-term effects are going to be absolutely massive. And so that's why I'd say the First World War did more for tanks than tanks did for the First World War.
Yeah, it's a really great way to sum that up, I think. The one thing that sticks in my mind, and I'll go with you along the it's complicated lines. I'll maybe go a little further, and I would say no, tanks are not the war-winning weapon, but yes, they are one of them. And I think those things, to my mind at least, can't be... You probably couldn't point to a single weapon, but you probably point to 5 or 6 and say that in combination they're successful. And one of the things that sticks in my mind that, of course, anybody really living since the 1930s wouldn't have seen, but anybody before that would have done, is if you were to go back to Britain in 1919, 1920, 1921, and you were to visit any one of hundreds of towns throughout the country, the one thing that you would have seen in each of those towns, particularly those that have made contributions to the tank fund, the tank bank as it was known, would have been an old First World War tank, sitting in a park somewhere on a plinth or next to the local war memorial, along with perhaps with a captured German Krupp gun. In the 1920s and 30s, these old relics of the First World War were sitting in most towns and villages throughout the UK. Anyone that had put any major contribution would have had a tank sitting in their local town. And really until the 1930s, just on the dawn of the Second World War, in fact, when they're all cut up for scrap and reused again, the tank was a regular sight for people back home. And I think that, if anything, gives perhaps some idea of the image and the importance that the British people placed on the use of the tank. So as far as the UK are concerned, and many other nations as well for that matter, the tank did have a key role to play. But as you say, Spence, maybe the story of the tank is the evolution and what we see at the end of the Second World War as a result.
Just to come in on that point about tank memorials, that's something that is of course lost in Britain. Like, you're absolutely right, Dan. Pretty much every town that has contributed to tanks or has got some connection to tanks has a tank memorial in a park or near a civic building. Nearly all of those tanks are lost in 1940 when the British Army, perhaps failing to learn the lessons of armoured warfare, has been heavily defeated along with the Allies in France. France has fallen. The British have evacuated Dunkirk. So much equipment has been lost in France. There's a desperate need for scrap metal. What does the military turn to? It turns to these tank memorials, and nearly all, in fact, all but a handful are destroyed. They're melted down to build the tanks of another war. Little Willie, that first tank, is in a memorial. It's saved. Remarkably, it's saved because it was earmarked to be melted down along with the other tanks in 1940. But I think that is a fascinating and almost poetic story that these tanks of the First World War, preserved as memorials, now get melted down to build the tanks for the next war.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. That's really good, mate. Whilst we're talking anyway, this can go in the outtakes. There was famously one of the tanks, I think it was in Lincoln or somewhere. A load of kids got arrested because somebody had left a shell in one, and they managed to fire fire a shell out of one of these memorial tanks, and all these local kids got nicked for it. It was quite good, I thought.
That's amazing. Well, trust the local youth, the men of England, to cause chaos like that.